CNI colloquium. First, we want to start off by acknowledging that Dr. Madison, Stefania Festival, and Coach Houston, a place that nation has called Sage Oaks since time immemorial. So I'm super excited to have Dr. Villeneuve here to speak with us and give us a talk. And I'm going to turn it over to Marino Miranda, who's going to introduce him.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. We have the pleasure of having Dr. Villeneuve here at the department with us. He's an assistant professor of United States History and American Indian Studies here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's of Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa descent and holds a PhD in history by the University of Michigan. Before coming here, he was a visiting fellow of history at Harvard, and his research focused on native histories of education and schooling. He's currently working on a book entitled Instrumental Indians, John Dewey and the Problem of the Frontier, 1884 to 1959. I'm sorry. This book is an intellectual history of America's most prominent philosopher of education and democracy and his relationship to the anti-democratic nature of federal Indian schooling. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Villeneuve.
Thanks so much. Well, thanks so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. I feel like I probably know more folks maybe in CNI than in history in my own department. You know, we have like 60 faculty, so this is sort of a warm welcome. So thank you all. Miigwech and Bojo, hello, I'm Matt Villeneuve. And so I'm super excited to share a little bit about some of my work, which I haven't really been able to touch in a while. Because I've been teaching. So this is a great excuse to sort of come back and visit the dissertation manuscript. So thank you for sort of bearing with me. So I want to start today with a story that's told sort of across Anishinaabe about Nanabush and a tree. So Nanabush, although commonly known as Nanabosho, I'll be referring to him as Nanabush or Nanapush today, right, is often described as an Anishinaabe trickster figure. And so capable, right, of great deeds of heroism and daring. Nanabush is also mischievous and a little sort of self-absorbed. And so like any good trickster, he kind of keeps people on their toes. And rarely he is so fleet of foot himself as to escape the consequences when others get wise to his antics. While the tellings of this particular story are never exactly the same, the many accountings of Nanabush quests for food seem to hinge on the trickster's encounter with a certain tree. The story seems to begin when Nanabush's hunger compels him to venture into the forest in search of food. In some tellings, he craftily tracks and kills a deer. Other times, it's elk or a moose, and whichever animal the given storyteller puts in his path, Nanabush invariably betrays his obligation to his four-legged relation. When it comes time to do the hard work of properly dressing his kill and preserving the meat for times of future hunger, Nanabush becomes lazy. All right, he opts to eat all the meat in one indulgent feast. But just as he prepares to dig in, Nanabush's sort of gluttonous feasting is interrupted, right, by a grating noise emanating from a nearby tree. And so Nanabush launches an inquiry, right? What happens next was probably first recorded in English by James Johnston, whose Anishinaabe name, right, means woman of the sound stars make in the sky, and her husband, Henry Rowe Schoolcraft. As the story was presented by Schoolcraft in his 1839 algic researches, Nanabush is just about to take his very first bite when, quote, a tree close to him makes a creaking noise caused by the rubbing of one large branch against the other. And so the sound immediately upsets Nanabush. I cannot eat while I hear such a noise. Stop, stop, he said to the tree. And so satisfied that he'd resolved this problem by airing the grievance, Nanabush goes back to eating his fill. Mid-bite, however, the tree's harangue returns to interrupt. In fact, each successive time that Nanabush goes to sort of raise food to his mouth, the tree begins to squeak and groan. And determined to silence this disturbance once and for all, Nanabush puts down his food and begins to climb the tree, right, to break off the offending branches. He climbed the tree and was pulling at the limb when his arm was caught between the two branches so that he could not extricate himself. Now caught in the branches, Nanabush can do little when a troop of wolves passes by. Determined to throw them off the scent of his food that he's left right on the ground, Nanabush calls out innocently, "Oh, what would come to get you here?" Right? Conferring amongst themselves, though, the wolves quickly see through this feint. "I begin to know him," said an old wolf, "and all his tricks." And sensing this deception, the wolves soon discover the resplendent meal that Nanabush had prepared for himself, but had abandoned in his misguided effort to silence the tree. The wolves then help themselves and they eat heartily, leaving Nanabush without sustenance, save for perhaps the nourishment derived from a parable of which he has seemingly become a part. "See the effect of meddling with frivolous things when I had certain good in my possession," end quote. Now, 175 years after that Nanabush story was recorded in Michigan by the Schoolcrafts, another telling was composed in 2014. And this one was told by the Ojibwe Cultural Foundation as "Nanabush Loses the Meat." It is structured as a tool for teaching children Anishinaabe. And so this encounter with the tree, narrated in both Anishinaabe and in English, is actually a little bit different from Schoolcraft's telling. And in this telling, Nanabush takes the path of least resistance to immediate gratification. And when the wind and the tree shame him for it, he quarrels with the tree and tries to silence it. By wrapping him in its branches, the tree turned the tables on Nanabush. Thereafter, the tree saw to it that the bounty of the hunt went to the people, in this case, more than human people, worthier than Nanabush. Furthermore, when Nanabush tries to fool the wolves, right, they see right through this ploy. They fill their bellies while Nanabush wriggles in the branches, suspended in the air, left with no recourse but to shake his fist. Now, Nanabush Loses the Meat is not only of interest as a kind of contemporary language teaching tool, an example of what scholars call culturally responsive or sustaining curriculum, but it's also kind of a telling story, right, with some crucial distinctions from those iterations intended for non-native audiences. So for example, right, in Schoolcraft's English translation, it's written, quote, "A tree close by him made a creaking noise caused by the rubbing of one large branch against the other." But when the story's told in Anishinaabe, and the narrator doesn't have to make this sort of like aside about the real or the true, or perhaps the efficient cause of the sound that Nanabush hears. By their combined effort instead, right, the wind and the tree simply play a trick on Nanabush. Given voice by the wind, the tree speaks, teasing him. Quote, "The tree creaked so loudly, it seemed to be talking, and it was talking to Nanabush," end quote. So in this formulation, the narrator communicates, right, the efficient cause behind the noise is the wind, but the listener simultaneously knows that the tree is the one doing the talking. And so telling the story this way doesn't require a kind of ontological stutter step, something like, in my words, Nanabush heard a noise, he thought it was the tree, but what he really heard was the wind, right? Instead, Nanabush hears the wind and the tree all at once in the act of teasing him. And this kind of synthesis, I think, is further underscored when Nanabush climbs the tree and uncovers then the nature of the conspiracy against him. Quote, "Once he got to the top, he noticed the wind caused all the branches to be tangled and rub against each other, giving the tree its voice," end quote. So in this telling, Nanabush's climb is also something of an investigation. And it's only when he gets to the top of the tree that he makes this discovery that the wind and the tree have conspired to speak out against his indulgence. And so in this way, I think the story operates to illustrate an indigenous epistemology that contemporary Anishinaabe scholars and others argue encompasses and unites both the everyday and the spiritual within the domain of experience. And so if you're familiar with American pragmatism, you might recognize that this idea kind of resembles, right, the philosophy of John Dewey, right? And this guy's born in Vermont in 1859, and he writes a prolific number of works defining the relationship between education and democracy. We all know he has an enormous corpus, right, spanning 37 volumes of books and articles that engage with political philosophy, psychology, ethics, history, aesthetics, epistemology. Okay, you get the idea. Dewey's philosophy of education, I think, includes a number of works in particular, right? From his first foray in 1895, Some Remarks on the Psychology of Number, to his 1897 My Pedagogic Creed, The School and Society in 1899, The Child and the Curriculum in 1902, Schools of Tomorrow in 1915, and his crowning sort of achievement, right, Democracy and Education in 1916, with then one more thrown in for good measure in a 1938, Education and Experience. And these works make up what I call Dewey's synthesis of education and democracy. In these works, Dewey effectively is dismantling the philosophical underpinnings of an older classical pedagogy of transactional learning and is reconstructing it with a new alternative, what he called experimentalism. And so Dewey's signal contribution, perhaps, to education and political theory was that his ideas about schooling and democracy began in his epistemology of experience. Dewey's philosophy of education was therefore part of what Robert Westbrook has called the pragmatist's, quote, war on epistemology, namely his unrelenting critique of the dualisms between thought and action that constituted, right, this unity of experience. The centrality of experience to learning is decidedly amenable to native pedagogy. For example, in their book, Power and Place, Indigenous scholars Vine Deloria Jr. and David Wildcat enumerate a host of factors in American education that are inimical, right, to Indigenous pedagogy. And many of the factors that Deloria and Wildcat illuminate are also subject to Dewey's critique. For example, following Alfred North Whitehead, Deloria and Wildcat critique what they call, quote, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which Dewey himself sized up as the philosopher's fallacy, or maybe the scientific positivism that underlay Western epistemology stretching back to Greek metaphysics. Yeah, you bet, Dewey condemned that as a misbegotten quest for certainty. And even academic disciplines as artificial constructs that prevent holistic inquiry, Dewey expressed sympathy for that idea as early as 1900 in his Some Stages of Logical Thought. So Wildcat went so far as to conclude that, quote, the hope for American Indian education lies in the active reconstruction of indigenous metaphysical systems, which I believe result in experiential systems of learning, end quote. Now, they're not the only ones, right? Rebecca Robin wrote a 1983 article in the Journal of American Indian Education descriptively titled, John Dewey and American Indians, a Brief Discussion of How It Would Work. In particular, Robin saw some potential in matching Dewey's critique of vocational education to the curriculum of boarding schools. And not long after, Indigenous theorist Sandy Grand cited Dewey as a foundational figure to Indigenous critical pedagogy itself. Quote, critical pedagogy is that discourse that emerged when critical theory encountered education, traced back to the works of Paulo Freire, John Dewey, and other social reconstructionists. This work has been followed more recently by work by Thomas Alexander, which compares Deweyan environmentalism to Pueblo creation stories and their qualities of emergence. Wildcat wrote approvingly, right, that pragmatists such as John Dewey placed the problem of human consciousness and spirit back into the debate between idealist and realist metaphysics in a way that is complementary to Indigenous thought. Perhaps no other scholar has probably better advanced the argument of the similarity between Indigenous epistemology and American pragmatism than Scott Pratt. Pratt offers a historical account of pragmatism that tracks with what he calls, quote, the possibility that native thought significantly influenced the development of American philosophy. Pratt's inquiry is fundamentally a historical question. If pragmatism is perhaps the distinctly American philosophy, especially vis-a-vis European philosophical traditions, where did its distinct qualities come from? Pratt argued that pragmatism's origins lies in philosophical ideas that were exchanged as a part of cultural interactions between Indigenous people and Euro-Americans in the span of the 17th and 19th centuries. And in particular, Pratt identifies four characteristics of pragmatism that he argues makes it distinct, right, from European or colonial philosophy, which he traces to Indigenous ideas. Those four commitments are the principles of interaction, pluralism, community, and growth. And this led Pratt to call pragmatism, quote, an Indigenous attitude counterpoised by a colonial attitude, Whereas the colonial attitude of European philosophy was always predicated on fixed categories, the pursuit of objective knowledge, stark dualisms between mind and body. Quote, the indigenous attitude emphasized things will be what they are in interaction. According to Pratt, unlike European philosophy and its colonial attitude, indigenous attitudes shared by indigenous people and American pragmatists were united in their commitment to a philosophy of experience. Not so fast, I say, right? My dissertation, Instrumental Indians, John Dewey and the Problem of the Frontier for Democracy and Indian Education, it goes on about as long as the actual dissertation, actually tries to re-examine this genealogy of pragmatism and its relationship to settler colonialism. Pragmatism is often described as America's distinctive philosophical tradition, but what then is its relationship to America's distinctive imagined pattern of historical development, the frontier? Instrumental Indians argues that Dewey's method of experimentalism is actually deeply embedded in the turn of the century ideas about the American frontier and their corollary erasure of Native people. Consequently, it actually challenges Dewey's widely acknowledged role in the foundation of critical democracy and emancipatory pedagogy through considering his biography, philosophy, and legacy in relationship to American Indian and indigenous people and their experience with decidedly anti-democratic schooling. And to do this, I posit sort of a new structure in Dewey's worldview, something I call the frontier discourse. That's under progress. We'll decide if we like that or not. Dewey's engagement with Indians, I think, was influenced by this discourse. And as a consequence, I argue that Dewey repeatedly invoked Indian people in the development of his philosophy of experimentalism. And particularly, I show how American Indians are actually a central part, right, of Dewey's psychology, his history, and his political theory. Instrumental Indians illustrates how Dewey repeatedly engaged in what I call the backgrounding and the foiling of Native people as historically, not racially, pre-reflective, pre-modern people. In contrast, Dewey rendered the American settler, the pioneer, as the reflective, modern, experimentalist par excellence. And so his reliance on the frontier ideas led to Dewey backgrounding or sidelining Native people in his philosophy, but also paradoxically relying on them as a foil that is in opposition to pragmatic epistemology. I call this the problem of the frontier, or more properly understood in sort of Deweyan lingo, the problems of the frontier. That on the one hand, the frontier experience of converting wilderness to civilization offered America as a nation what Dewey called a problematic situation solved through settlement that led to the development of what he called intelligence. And that this origin undermines experimentalism's, theoretical appeal to Native scholars and people. And I frame this as a discourse because Dewey repeatedly engaged in these ideas about the frontier, which were clearly the product of Frederick Jackson Turner and other progressive era thinkers. And this is an innovation in the field because until now, most scholars have examined Dewey's relationship to Native people, if at all, through the lens of race. Many scholars have observed Dewey's lack of critical engagement with race and white supremacy. Thomas Fallachet has argued that Dewey's engagement with Indians comes through the frame of racial recapitulation. And he argues that this was a perishable device that Dewey jettisons by the 1930s. And my work challenges that argument for three reasons. First, I suggest that Dewey's reliance on this frontier discourse, it outlives his use of racial recapitulation. Secondly, Dewey's textual treatment and political advocacy for Black Americans changes over time towards more humanistic descriptions, while his invocations of Native people remain largely unchanged over time. And third, race is altogether probably the wrong rubric for understanding Native nations in relationship to fundamental categories like democracy and education. And that argument is not just sort of about what Analytica's right in terms of the academy. I also show how it directly shaped Dewey's ideas and how those ideas directly shaped federal Indian schooling and policy from the 1890s to the 1930s. So we follow, for example, in my dissertation, right, how Dewey's education was interpreted by the likes of federal Indian educators and theorists like William Torrey Harris, Estelle Reel, John Collier, Will Carson Ryan, Willard Beatty, right, Moises Sign and Pedro Orata, who all applied their understanding of Dewey's ideas to the policies of the Indian Office and its school system. And the results, I argue, were hardly an achievement of democracy in education for Native people in the face of the boarding school system. This is in large part due to the fact that while he could be critical of the legacies of settlement, Dewey was never able to shake the frontier discourse and its image of the pioneer as a pragmatic actor. And so when Dewey imagined the school as a social center, he described a settlement house. And settlement houses are embedded in what I call frontier progressivism, right? And they prove to be a really poor model for Native schooling because they empower progressive educators, not Native leaders, to plan Native people's relationship to democracy. So when Dewey's philosophy was translated into federal Indian schooling, his synthesis of education and democracy failed to deliver meaningful self-determination in Native ed. And that led Dewey to treat Native people as an instrument for his philosophy, rather than as a contemporary political constituency, which might have benefited from its application. So I just want to pause for a moment to say that one of the great pleasures of building a talk like this is revisiting the manuscript. And something I have found since I wrote the dissertation was this great graph that comes out of this, out of Jess Gilbert's recent book that's sort of trying to lay out an intellectual history. So I made my version, which, as you can see, is probably going to be even more confusing than helpful. The project sort of charts these sort of three groups, right, that Dewey's sort of at the center of. And I'm sort of suggesting that if we put Dewey in the center, we sort of see a new network emerge that we haven't seen before. So these are just some of the people that I'm tracking in the course of the dissertation, right, and in the project, and sort of what are their linkages and what's their relationship to Native schooling. Some of these names you might recognize, right? Others might be new. And in particular, there's this group of folks I call the Deweyan Brain Trust, which really adapt Indian policy in the 1930s. And then I'm sort of throwing in three indigenous interlocutors in particular, and then suddenly we get a graph that looks like this, you know, and I'm a big Star Wars fan, and I was like, this looks like the Death Star, you know? I'm like, how does this make it legible, right? So it's sort of a little bit like adapting a dissertation manuscript. It's sort of like facing on the Death Star. So all of that is to say, I also contrast this failed application of Dewey's ideals to actual Indian schooling in his lifetime by exploring an indigenous alternative, right? Laura Cornelius Kellogg. Just 6 years after Dewey's Education and Democracy, with all of its backgrounding and foiling of Native people, Kellogg published her own book called Our Democracy in the Indian in 1920. And in it, she offered a Native-centered synthesis of education and democracy. And for that reason, I argue that Kellogg is actually not simply a native Deweyan or even an indigenous anti-Dewey. I actually think he's an indigenous pragmatist. She not only treated Native people as a constituency, but unlike Dewey, she offered an anti-colonial synthesis of education and democracy. Her career in education, activism, and writing demonstrates all the hallmarks of not only a pragmatic philosopher, centering experience, but also kind of a Deweyan experimentalist, namely using philosophy to address contemporary social problems, especially in education. And in so doing, I argue that pragmatists should take her career as seriously as they do Dewey. Despite these deficiencies, though, in Dewey's method, I assert there's actually much to consider in Dewey's philosophy, which remains of great potential for Native educators, historians, and philosophers. I also emphasize how indigenous pragmatists like Kellogg were kind of doing Dewey one better, right? Using many of the fruits of the native roots of pragmatism to address anti-democratic education in the lives of their families, their communities, and their nations. Now, I conclude that there remains great anti-colonial potential in pragmatism and in Dewey, especially for Native education. But before scholars explore that, we must first decolonize Dewey. And one way to test that is through Nanabojo, because Dewey heard that story that I started this talk with. We don't know where, although I have a suspicion about that. We might talk about that later. But when he heard that story, he heard something very different. So let's talk about that. Dewey heard this Nanabush story sometime around 1893, 2 years after he became an advisor at the University of Michigan to a student monthly literary journal called The Inlander. In addition to advising its undergraduate writers, Dewey also authored a column of his own called The Angle of Reflection. And Brian Williams argues, interestingly enough, that it was this column in this little journal where Dewey began to imagine for the first time an audience beyond the academy. And this is evidenced, I think, in his first Angle of Reflection column, where Dewey wrote that the Inlander's purpose was to represent the vitality of a university in a region regarded by East Coast intellectuals as a provincial frontier outpost. Dewey wrote that the magazine's objectives was to, quote, express and encourage the articulate voicing of that part of the vast, dumb inland to which it belongs, right? In other words, Dewey began his career perhaps as a public intellectual in defense of Michigan and its university, not as a primitive frontier outlier, but as a place of high learning, as cutting edge as anywhere else. In April of 1893, Dewey wrote one such essay, right, called Anthropology and Law. And in this essay, Dewey contemplated the historical nature of laws. How does a society come to be shaped by a certain set of rules? Where do these rules come from? Inheritance, invention, some combination of the two? And how do those rules change over time as societies develop? Except as an early draft of themes which would appear more fully in Dewey's later publications, Anthropology and the Law is perhaps actually pretty unremarkable, and it's rarely treated by Dewey scholars. But in that essay contains one of the rare moments when Dewey actually explicitly mentioned indigenous people, and for that purpose, it merits closer inspection. Dewey used Anthropology and the Law primarily to explore the history of the legal concept of indirect liability as a feature in the law of the United States. While Dewey suggested that the emerging discipline of anthropology might offer empirical insights about the historical origins of laws in general, Dewey asserted that this was particularly useful as a means to excavate the history of indirect liability in particular. Dewey asserted that, quote, it is a commonplace of anthropology that the primitive man sees only himself in all his surroundings. His whole world was himself, spread out for inspection, end quote. Dewey illustrated this claim by imagining that if an anthropologist were to ask a primitive man why he engaged in such activities as, say, running, that this primitive man would surely respond, quote, because he was alive. Dewey insisted that the same explanation could then be projected by this primitive man onto the world around him: rivers, clouds, the wind, trees. All of this moved because they were also thought to be alive. Seemingly self-evident human qualities were understood by primitive people as ontological reality. Quote, when he struck someone, primitive man, he struck because he was angry and he wished to hurt, Dewey declared of this imaginary man. If a tree fell on his hut, there would be no other reason. So savage mind anthropomorphizes the world. And so to underscore this point, Dewey offered his readers his own telling of the Nanabush story. Quote, in one of the Chippewa Indian legends, it is told of the good spirit that after a long and toilsome struggle with the evil spirit, finally secures an elk for himself. The good spirit is Dewey's version of Nanabush, often regarded by Euro-Americans as kind of a Chippewa demigod, right? Dewey narrates that as Nanabush stoops low to dress his kill, quote, he hears a creaking in the tree above him made by the rubbing of branches together. In Dewey's telling, the sound is immediately attributed to branches. Quote, the good spirit, famished as he in, stops to say, ah, you have troubled me enough, you evil one, but I am not going to hear you croak while I'm eating my dinner. So he climbs the tree and cuts off the limb. That sentence ends with an exclamation mark. And I think it's sort of Dewey finishing the story as if it were a punchline, right? Anticipating that his readers are going to treat the story's conclusion as kind of a humorous non sequitur, right? Based off what he wrote immediately thereafter. Quote, what similarity is there between this frame of mind and the modern law regarding the responsibilities of employers for the damage done by their employees in the course of their work? None whatsoever, right? He says with another exclamation mark. But this is a feint, because Dewey then suggested that the story of Nanabush could be read as a window, right, into the origin of the constituent ideas that make up the modern concept of indirect liability. Dewey suggested that the good spirit's frame of mind might be the undeniable offspring of the law of indirect liability for acts of servants and for animals owned by one, which informed modern labor law. The Nanabush story slotted right into Dewey's emerging naturalism, specifically his psychological functionalism. Going back in history, Dewey wrote, is like going from the mouths of rivers now far separate as the Pacific and the Gulf of Mexico, to a common watershed. I want to illustrate this general truth by some facts in the development of law, showing how some of the most highly developed legal ideas and practices of today can be traced to a beginning in the crude psychological structure of primitive man. That meant, quote, that Nanabush was ripe. I should say that's end quote. Now I'm talking. That meant that Nanabush was ripe for the taking as evidence for the new psychology. In this story of Nanabush the tree, Dewey argued that he had found an even more ancient iteration of the practice of ancient Greeks, described by Plato, to hold inanimate objects responsible in criminal proceedings. Here is the object is recognized as lifeless, Dewey explained, but the story points like a needle to a pole to a time when the object was just as personal and just as personally responsible as any murderer can be, end quote. So in this view, the attitude of the Chippewa to regard trees as a living entity responsible for disrupting meals had just kind of evolved into Greek law. He conscripted the story of Nanabush into a historical account of this idea for the agency of inanimate objects, stating that it had developed so that in, quote, the old maritime law, the ship was made both the source and the limit of liability. Not the owner, but the ship had to be proceeded against. This premise formed a link from Michigan indigenous people to Greece, to the American merchant marine, and then finally to modern corporate law. In his conclusion, Dewey made the Nanabush story and its important role in his account a part of his naturalistic method. Quote, I do not mean, of course, that these early customs of the savage mind are the causes of our modern law practice, Dewey clarified. Instead, the Chippewa story was evidence that illustrated a historical account of a modern phenomenon, right? In this case, the Chippewa, the Greek, the American conceptions were all, quote, simply a question of morphology. Dewey used his understanding of Nanabush as the foundation then for his naturalism. Quote, the rules are nonetheless the historical children of the old customs, preserved and modified through the agency of natural selection, end quote. And I think that last line is critical because in this otherwise unremarkable essay, Dewey invokes Michigan's indigenous people, right? He's at Michigan. This is about sort of thinking through place. He invokes them to stake out one of the most innovative ideas central to his method of experimentalism. Just as natural selection is nature's mechanism for change over time, so too is the scientific method humanity's way of directing social change over time. If you knew a noise made by a tree was the result of the wind in its branches and not a result of its intention to mock you, then there was no need to anthropomorphize the tree and certainly no need to cut off its limb. In other words, Dewey seems to understand the personification of the tree as a logical outcome of, quote, primitive psychology. And the scientific method had helped humans surpass these earlier habits of thinking, such as those seemingly embodied in the Nanabush story. And so Dewey's reference to natural selection, it's not an analogy, right? More than illustrate mere continuity between Anishinaabe lifeways and US law, Dewey suggested that the change over time that had elapsed between this Chippewa story and modern law was the product of evolution itself. Every new institution is, like the organ of an animal, an old one modified, he wrote. But whereas natural selection governed the changes of animals, what force dictated such changes in humanity? Dewey's answer was the burgeoning insights of the new psychology. It is a psychological law, a law which may be said to underlie all history, that the mind can attend to anything only as that thing enters into some action, only as it is to be put to some use, like pragmatism, right? So far as then as any law, any institution loses all practical value, it inevitably drops back out of consciousness. The new use is read into affairs. And in so doing, interpretation has taken place. And the old institution has changed its form by taking on a new function. And all of this without any breach of continuity. So for Dewey, right, the stories of Michigan indigenous people therefore represents a window into the history of that psychology. The meaning of this story, Dewey suggests dismissively, quote, if we had time to go into it, would simply be a reflection of the struggle of the Indian himself for food against the odds of climate and a bad season, end quote. I argue that Dewey's treatment of this Nanabush story is largely indicative of the way in which indigenous people are represented throughout the entirety of his life's work. This Chippewa legend that he cites, I think, represents then a tangible link between what I'm calling this frontier discourse and its dismissal of native ways of knowing as possibly modern, contemporary ways that people still thought and learned and told that story, right? Connecting that to his experimentalism. While you don't know exactly where it came from, we do know what he heard in this story. In this story, he's not discerning folklore, but he's reading history. And that history is connected to the present in a way fairy tales only superficially gestured, right? Nanabush offered Dewey a genealogy of functional psychology. So Dewey's contorting the story into what he wants to hear. Namely, he wants to see a story told by Indians as savages about vengeance on a tree that flows into Greek religious cults, which in turn develops into modern corporate law. It's a through line in human history about inanimate objects taking on a life of their own. And so an Indian story offers a convenient way to make that kind of temporal portage. Dewey thought Nanabush was significant because of how he captured both primitive psychology and hinted at the experimentalist future to come. Where Dewey should have heard noise from a tree, he thought he heard a signal, and he tried to extract it. And in so doing, he failed to learn the lesson that Nanabush might have taught him, that there are still Anishinaabe people, there still were Anishinaabe people living all around him in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, still speaking. Nearly 30 years passed before Dewey might have considered Nanabush again, because it's possible there's a second brush that Dewey might have had, right? And it came in the guise of Paul Radin. Radin's an anthropologist, a folklorist, a linguist. He made his career studying American Indian people. He wrote a 1911 dissertation called The Ritual Significance of the Winnebago Medicine Dance. So he worked with Ho-Chunk people. In fact, his long career in anthropology and folklore relied on indigenous informants, mostly among the Ho-Chunk. And in 1956, Radin published a book called The Trickster, a study in American Indian mythology, a collection of stories purporting to feature trickster figures across indigenous communities. And a part of this research, Radin produced a very similar version of the story of Nanabush and the tree. And Radin's unnamed Ho-Chunk informant, perhaps Crashing Thunder, his longtime sort of research partner, related how Nanabush's feast had been disrupted. So as early as 1927, Radin had collected a number of such stories, which grounded a book titled Primitive Man as Philosopher, a book he hoped would be a path-breaking study of the historical and psychological origins of philosophy. As such, he insisted that there would be no one else more fit to write its introduction than John Dewey. And in the book's acknowledgments, Radin saved his most profound expression of gratitude for last, writing, quote, his sincere thanks to Professor John Dewey for his kindness in reading the proof and writing the foreword. And the 6 pages of this foreword are perhaps Dewey's most explicit writing about American Indian people. Now, in this piece, at first glance, Dewey's introduction seems to suggest a notable change over time in his thinking about American Indian people. First, Dewey concurs with Radin's rejection of racial recapitulation and the application of cultural relativism to the study of primitive people, including Aztecs, Mayans, Bushmen, peoples of the Nigerian coast, Australians, Polynesians, and American Indian people. Second, in the foreword, Dewey seems to endorse Radin's fundamental idea that indigenous people are and were capable of doing something that resembled philosophy. And in such a concession, Dewey finally appears to have conceded that the category of the presumed savage was not incompatible with that of the philosopher. Dewey praised Radin's work by explaining to readers that, quote, no one concerned with the intellectual history of mankind, especially with the background of what has now become more or less conventionally set apart as philosophy, can fail to be intensely interested in the material which he has advanced, end quote. Whereas a generation of Euro-American scholars had located the origins of philosophy in a rudimentary form of the beliefs and rights of Indians as savages, which civilized philosophy had since surpassed, Radin told a different story. And Dewey seemed particularly animated by the resonances with Radin's approach to the historical origins of philosophy and Dewey's own developing critique of constituting philosophy as a means of inquiry that were isolated from experimentalism. He wrote, quote, under the influence of modern philosophical theories, it has been assumed that the object and the world were first regarded as collections of sense data, with the obvious inconsistencies with this notion have been accounted for as animistic and supernatural injections. Radin's scholarship, Dewey suggested, explodes this traditional notion. He makes it clear that objects and nature were conceived dynamically, that change, transition were primary, and transformation into stability something to be accounted for, end quote. Rather than his 1893 reading of the Nanabush and the tree story as a story born from savage mind, now Dewey appeared more willing to include American Indian people in the history of not just philosophy, but maybe in experimentalism. And so as a consequence, his introduction consequently seems like a crucial hinge point for the purposes of tracking the place of indigenous people in Dewey's turn towards cultural pluralism. Several years later, Dewey would insist that such myths that were authored by the savage mind, right, careful scholars might find in them the power of historical contingency upon psychological development. Should philosophers only abandon their, quote, mentalistic psychological interpretation of experience and instead embrace the paradigm that psychology was a product of interaction with environment, then Dewey suggested, quote, the historic course of the experiential development of the sciences out of experiences of the sort found among savage people would suffice to prove that experience, end quote. That itself, the naturalistic method of evolution, science, and experimentalism. When we explain a curious superstition entertained by members of a savage tribe, we do not so, on my theory, by referring it to consciousness, but to specifiable natural conditions, traditions and institutions being included in this case among natural conditions, end quote. Therefore, Dewey's introduction, man, seems to mark almost maybe an explicit refutation of this older attitude with a new concession, right, about the psychological and historical significance of stories like that of Nanabush. But despite his seemingly potential willingness to fold indigenous thought into the category of philosophy, however, Dewey's attitudes about actual indigenous people were still constrained by the frontier discourse. His habit of instrumentalizing Indians seemed to make it impossible for Dewey to interpret his indigenous contemporaries as philosophers. Even after he read Radin's book, wrote its foreword, right, Dewey continued to write about Indians for much of the 20s and 30s in ultimately dismissive ways that were far more consistent with his depictions of Indians as early as the 1890s. According to Dewey, Radin's finding enjoined, quote, the student of moral and social philosophy to give serious attention to the weighty mass of evidence, which is adduced to show that early man, instead of being enslaved to the group to the point of absorption in it, was in fact highly individualistic, within certain limits, more so than modern civilized man. Dewey continued in this vein, the extent to which early ethical judgments in the way of social condemnation were limited to special occasions, instead of being generalized into judgments of character at large, raised the question whether their moral standpoint was not insofar sounder than which civilized progress has developed, end quote. So such accounts, though, while they're made in a maybe approving fashion, they're still associating Native peoples' supposedly superior ethical disposition beyond of and outside of civilization and modernity. And so while he appreciated Radin's work, he never really incorporated its lessons into his own philosophy. that indigenous people were still using Nanabush to make meaning of their ongoing experience. And for this reason, such appreciation did not translate to careful attention to the contemporary political struggles of indigenous people. And in time, the silence would compound, leaving America's foremost philosopher of education and democracy muted on the egregiously anti-democratic schooling of Native people in his own lifetime. But this does not mean, however, I think that there's nothing in Dewey's method from which we might reconstruct. For those familiar with Dewey's philosophy experience, there seems to me to be much that does resonate in the encounter between Nanabush and the tree. The way Nanabush heard the noise from the wind in the tree sounds a lot like Dewey's 1896 reflex arc. Dewey argued that humans respond to stimuli not by cause and effect, but all at once. Right? Noisy trees are a feature of the environment itself, not a mental state in a listener's mind. Nanabush was irritated, not simply because he heard the tree, but because the tree had made the environment noisy. Furthermore, Nanabush's climb to discover the wind's effect on the tree does seem a lot like kind of an Anishinaabe version of Dewey's matrix of inquiry. Indeed, Nanabush experiences the tree as talking, whose words are disorienting and undesirable. It's a problematic situation in need of remedy to restore the placid flow of experience. So Nanabush's climb might be understood as a kind of inquiry intended to resolve a problematic situation. His inquiry yields not experimental intelligence, but actually, right, humiliation. If the situation had been transformed, then it would have been changed as Nanabush came to realize that he was being chastised by the wind in the tree. And that new understanding would have offered Nanabush and his listeners greater control, right, over their environment, which suggests further lines of action. In this case, right, to cease being greedy and to attend to the proper obligations to his relation, right, Wawashkeshi, the deer. Regarding Dewey's experimentalism alongside this Nanabush story, rather than as its instrument, I think suggests, right, how Dewey's experimentalism may yet be of some use for the articulation of an anti-colonial praxis in contemporary indigenous education. This is because, right, in conclusion, hearing a story about Nanabush is an education. Right? Nanabush fails as often as he succeeds. He plays tricks, he suffers mischief, he tries, he fails, he tries again. And from these exploits, Anishinaabe people are offered lessons about doing things in a good way or not. Either way, Nanabush teaches. Nanabush is a figure appropriate to culturally relevant curriculum today, right? Because he speaks to indigenous experience and indigenous ways of knowing. And in this way, an indigenous insistence on teaching Nanabush is just one valence removed from an insistence on self-determination in education. Today, Nanabosho has pulled off the ultimate pedagogical trick. He's both the object of the learning itself and the means by which to teach it. As Nanabosho walked the earth, he grew in wisdom, writes Anishinaabe author Linda Lagarde Grover. Today, as our ancestors did, we learn about the world and the good ways to be by hearing the stories about his life and adventures. Listening to indigenous storytellers who kept Nanabush alive all these years, and when I listen to them, I hear not an experimentalism defined through indigenous stories, but rather the embodiment of an indigenous experimentalist himself. But to hear him, one has to actually listen. As Grover suggests, quote, the Ojibwe way, which requires one to listen quietly, attentively, and with your heart as well as your ears. So thank you for listening, and miigwech. So I'm happy to take questions about that or anything else in this crazy sort of dissertation model mock-up. You know, there's lots of schools we could talk about and the weird interactions about Native people at the lab school, how that's translated into the federal Indian school system, how Dewey goes to Hawaii with a family of missionaries and sees the Kamehameha school, interacting with weird ways with Kanaka Maoli people and settler colonialism there, right? How the lab school is funded by expropriated wealth from Hawaiian colonialism, right? There's the receipts. Or finally, we can watch that Deweyan cluster in the Federal Indian School Service in the 1930s create what they think is going to be the ultimate Deweyan school on the Pine Ridge Reservation. All these guys talking about Dewey that go into the federal government. They create this school in Kyle, the Little Wound Day School, still a school today. So we can do any of that or more. I'm happy to chat. Wonderful. Well, seeing none. Okay. Question?
I mean, there's a little bit of interesting. Even like one of the first ones you showed them was Moisés Sáenz. He went back to Mexico and he was like lead of the Department for Indigenous Affairs.
You got it.
Back there.
Mhm.
And I think he was a student from Dewey, so this is really interesting.
Yes. This is a huge part of the last chapter of the book, but it also draws on Ruben Flores' excellent study of this, right? And so this is one of the stories about how this is sort of an international project, borrowed actually from rural schooling in Mexico. That's going to be the model, plus the settlement house. That's going to be the new model for Indian education. Yeah. So thank you for noticing that.
Yeah. Super interesting. But what I wanted to ask you, like different, it has to do with the distinction between race and indigeneity that you kind of draw. And whether you could think in terms of like an environmental reading, like, or a geographic reading, rather like a philosophy of the Atlantic, very much linked to race and Africa and that, and a philosophy of the frontier.
Yeah.
Like, with a different understanding of nature, and I think like also nature is.
Yeah, that's such a good question. In fact, in part because this is one of the things I haven't quite thought through, so part of what the work really argues is that place mattered. So it's the Dewey scholarship sort of says all the good stuff starts off in Dewey's career when he gets to New York. So all that early stuff is sort of juvenilia. And I'm like, wait a minute, he's in Michigan for 10 years, and then he goes to the lab school for another decade in Chicago. How is he encountering ideas about this place? And so drawing on, folks like Michael Wittgen, who are sort of thinking about this is kind of a native new world. It's not a transatlantic sort of world. It's its own sort of place. It's very, sort of indigenous. It's had its own intellectual history and formation, right? So let's take that seriously. How would that shape, philosophy, American philosophy? So how race fits into that is a sort of a complicated story, especially vis-a-vis these ideas of environmentalism. That I think remains slightly sort of unresolved. That's one way to think about these sort of tandem histories or genealogies in Dewey, vis-a-vis how he writes about African Americans and the struggle against white supremacy, which he very slowly sort of comes to. Not so for Native people. They always seem to just be racialized as savage folks. So how that's connected to his understanding of the frontier, I haven't quite sort of pulled out yet, but that's where I would point. So I don't know if that even remotely addresses your thought, but it's a good one, right? Thinking about place, shaping these intellectual histories. Yes, of course.
I feel like this is a very unformed thought, but thank you.
Oh my gosh. I felt this was a very unformed talk. So
Dewey and little about this time frame and so on. So I'm just going to throw this out.
Yes, please.
What struck me about the story of Nanabush is how in Dewey's interpretation, the story got worse, like less interesting as a piece of literature. The idea of the tree talking is more interesting from a literary perspective, right? It's more maybe even in line with like certain European American ideals of literature at the time, like something like T.S. Eliot or the effect of correlative, or the idea that like things like that there's no truth but the thing itself. Like I'm looking over at Peter over there. I'm messing up the literature too. So anyway,
yes.
Thoughts just from like a narrative or storytelling perspective, because I couldn't help but think listening to your talk.
Yeah.
Dewey was like messing up all the storytelling. And then some of the restorative work or the work that you're doing is kind of like restory this in a more accurate way, starting from this this one story of Nineveh. So
Yeah.
anyway, take whatever.
No, that's great. That's very formative. We can work with this.
Okay.
Yeah. So I so appreciate that you think sort of this is an act of restoring, because that actually resonates a lot with my sort of practice and method. So I think that's very articulate. I might borrow that. It reminds me though of, your point about literature, because interestingly, in the chapter where I work on the lab school, Hiawatha comes up. Dewey's obsessed with Hiawatha. Educators are obsessed with Hiawatha, right? Longfellow's, the quintessential American literature at the time. And he gets into this sort of interesting debate vis-a-vis Hiawatha and the lab school, where he says, should we use Hiawatha, Chris, you wrote it, right? Should we use Hiawatha as an act of literature? Should we make the kid, let the kids read Hiawatha? Maybe that's how they'll understand history. They can imagine a world that's created in your mind through literature, and you can inhabit that world. And Dewey's like, no, that's not going to work. That's not real experience. So instead of actually having the students read Hiawatha, right, why don't we actually tell them that they should be Indians themselves? Let's recreate human history. Each of our classes will be a tribe, right? So, and they're going to reenact human history in the sandbox, right? And they're going to have to sort of, here's Dewey describing what this looks like, sort of acting out this sort of history of mankind vis-a-vis this implied subject position. So I'm arguing that this is sort of where racialization, right, meets history in the form of racial recapitulation. But it's sort of distinct because in this era, we know that there's this really other big cultural process of playing Indian, where you sort of imagine yourself in this sort of imagined subject position. So I call this sort of like pedagogical playing Indian, or in the dissertation, I call this replaying Indian, because you're replaying human history, but you're kind of like imagining that you're there. You're trying to recreate experience in the classroom. That's what you're doing, which Native educators were like, oh, that's actually perfect for actual Native students, right? So here's Estelle Real sort of adapting Dewey and what he's doing at the lab school for use in Indian boarding schools. So that all is by way of sort of like this literature bit. I know it's not quite about narrative, but it is an interesting moment where Dewey's thinking explicitly about literature and Native literature. Hiawatha is Native literature, right? And what's its place? And he rejects it. He says literature is actually not going to be helpful. What if we recreated Native experience in the classroom? That's how we can teach history.
Thereby bypassing a Native narrative point,
Absolutely.
Right? Address or grapple with that narrative voice that was not experienced by that white children were experiencing.
Yes, which is interesting. This goes back to, Lorena, your question here. I think I have this. Susan Blow comes to the lab school to see this, and she's scandalized. She's like, all these kids are running around like Indians. Like, this is racially dangerous. Like, we don't want these. All the kids of the faculty of the University of Chicago, right? Like, do they know what's happening here? And then Dewey and his teachers, all of which are sort of, progressive women teachers, they're the ones that write about, no. This is why this is really good pedagogy, right? So it's just a funky, weird moment that I think's been really overlooked as sort of a weird debate about, Herbartianism that I think is actually bigger. It's a bigger sort of cultural story about imagining yourself as a Native person, right? Which we always see in sort of didactic enterprise, right? The Boy Scouts, outdoor education, it's always pedantic. Yeah.
Again, have one thought.
Yeah, please, we love those. Those are the best.
What that makes me think of actually is two things. One is the history of process drama
Mm.
and the role of process drama, which comes out of primarily a British tradition of the role of drama-based embodied experiences, which are positioned as purposefully non-consequential, right? So you can embody identities without consequence as a child when you engage in a process drama. I don't want to, it's not reenactment, right?
Yeah,
It invites
right.
young people to embody perspectives with the idea that you can do that without having to actually take on
Right.
the problems of a particular identity. So it makes me think of that, but also I've been reflecting on the ways in which US-based schooling disciplines shape what's possible and not possible in these models. Because I was thinking of like, oh, well, we call this history class.
Right.
So like, it can't really be literature because literature is something else.
Mhm.
Or we call this, like, we're doing science. And so this thing that's like not scientized is maybe less helpful in what it is we want young people to understand about this thing we call science, or this thing we call history, or this thing we call literature. And as an arts educator, I
Yes.
know a lot about how those predefined disciplines actually make problematic
Mhm.
deep learning, because it forces us to take things apart that actually
Cohere,
or
perhaps.
coexist as a thing that doesn't have to be cut up into
Yeah.
our disciplinary buckets.
Well, I so appreciate the parallel there about the liminality of that sort of dramanness, that this is something you can step out of. That's a big part of especially what's happening here at the lab school. Yeah, so thinking about that, thank you for that. The process drama, it's a great point. Yeah,
Just follow up.
Follow up.
So are you actually saying you think this is inconsequential? Because I think it's really consequential.
No, I wasn't. Okay, I was simply connecting another. Not being an historian and not being like connecting another historical movement
Yeah.
that I'm familiar with from my perspective that has asked pedagogically to consider similar questions, but from a different
Yeah.
thread, which is this like Dorothy Heathcote and the notion of what process drama can
Mhm.
do for young children.
But Matt, would you argue that this is a way that even if this had been based on that, it undercuts the notion that it's inconsequential to do that, because this
Oh, I-
would, yeah,
Yeah, okay, I mean, I think, yeah,
okay, I just wasn't sure.
yeah.
yeah, I think it's more the imagined weightlessness of putting on a headdress, or which is not, I've looked through all the historic photographs of lab school. I can't actually find that, but I find a bunch of this stuff of like accoutrements the students are working with, or they're building, or, this is the closest I could get. They go visit the Fort Dearborn Massacre Memorial on a field trip, right? This is like an innovation. And then the students working for Dewey, right? Mayhew and Edwards afterwards, they have the students recreate these poses, and that's art class. Then they all sketch each other, right? So I mean, like, that's the closest I can get to actually let's step into a physical sort of embodiment. But that's part of the work I'm doing, is saying that kind of performance, that imagination is happening here too, even though we're not putting on feathers. And so that's what links it to this sort of larger, sort of performative play that's happening culturally, right? Yes.
You might not, I mean, I'm gonna ask a question that maybe feels less relevant now because you're further away from the text. But in talking about the lab school and this sort of possible subjecthoods for
Yeah.
the savage mind, the savage child, I'm wondering about the possible subjecthoods that come up for Dewey, but also Dewey's influence on something like Hull House.
Oh, yeah.
Gene
Yeah.
Adams and these sort of like, what are the possibilities for subjecthood of the immigrant child? And how, in thinking about a democratic project, if that child no longer becomes immigrant, if there's a pathway out of subjecthood, I'm wondering if there's similar discourse around that, how those interact.
Yeah.
Ever a time now, I'm like wondering, are there any pictures of these children in Chicago and Hull House dressing up in dresses? And how do they?
That's a good question.
Like, how do they interact with that story of potentially inheriting a particular story makes them then no longer, immigrant in
Yeah.
America? So I don't know if you ran across anything around that, or maybe just a more simple question is
Sure.
parallels between the discourse of the immigrant, quote unquote, and the savage in this kind of progressive education early
Yes.
stages that people like to ignore.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, two ways into that question. First is, so when Dewey comes to New York, he ends up working for the New York People's Institute, which is the sort of, settlement house organization there. And that's where he partners. He at least shows up like once. I know they're there. Collier reads him. He's listed as sort of on the board of his training school. And this is a training school for settlement house workers. So Collier becomes an educator first, which is another thing that's totally ignored in his biography. as a Deweyan educator, training settlement house workers in a settlement house in New York. And in 1919, he's like, I give up. Dude, there's no way we can achieve the substitution of the immigrant to the American. It's all, modernity sucks. I'm out of here. And he goes on vacation to Taos, New Mexico in 1920. And he's like, I discovered Indians. And this is the kind of collective, anti-modernity I think is going to lead us back to democratic renewal. And that's the origin story of Collier's career in, Indian policy, right? The most consequential sort of commissioner of Indian affairs in this century sits right at the transition that you're articulating between settlement house, right, and native folks. The other way in is the actual people that encounter Dewey while he's at the Hull House, namely the Castle family, of which two other Mary Tenney's daughters, whose name escapes me at the moment, Helen Castle, I think, and Mary Castle, who marries George Herbert Mead. So the family's really, really close. They are like these settler colonial scions, right, in Hawaii that are slowly but surely sort of infiltrating, right, the government. Here's Castle himself, right, and they're going to be major actors in deposing the Queen in the coup, right, in 1893. Long story short, eventually, not only is she bankrolling the lab school, but she invites Dewey to come to Hawaii in 1899 and help them create a kindergarten. And so they're imagining sort of like, what if we create a kindergarten part settlement house, sort of imagining, right, that this is what we'll do, right, for Hawaii. And so this sort of settler colonial generation starts arguing that, like, yeah, Hawaii is American through its schools, through its weird blend of settlement houses, schooling, and we got John Dewey. And so by the time we get to statehood, there are people like saying, oh, our schools are in Hawaii are super Deweyan. That's why we're American. You should, annex us. So complicated story about settlement houses. Actually, the title of that chapter is putting the settler in the settlement house, right? And so this is part of that trajectory. I don't know if that gets close.
I was just super curious.
Yeah, but the lab school Hull House thing is definitely one of those really important nodes. Yeah.